Dear alumni, members of the campus community, and dear friends of McGill campus, welcome to this masterclass on the topic of Indigenous peoples' nutrition, food security, and well-being. This is presented to you by the Faculty of Agriculture and Environmental Sciences during McGill's At Home Homecoming 2020. My name is Anya Geitman. I'm the Dean of the Faculty and the Associate Vice Principal of McGill campus, and today I am your host. I'm very glad that you decided to dial into our first ever homecoming at home, since it allows you to connect to McGill campus right from your screen. We're really excited to be able to bring you contents that will hopefully more than compensate for our inability to meet in person this year. I can reassure you that the faculty in the campus, McGill campus, are doing well, and you won't be surprised to hear that many of the activities at McGill have been maintained during the pandemic. The farm, for example, remains fully operational, and we are having a great crop at the Hort Center, thanks to Mike Leo and his team. Paul Meldrum also keeps the dairy and the seed farm running, and I really acknowledge the enormous effort it has taken to put in place the health and safety measures that are necessary to do so safely. So far, fingers crossed, everything works out smoothly. The pandemic has, of course, thrown a wrench into some of our projects, especially construction, but we're catching up on these now, and we hope to be back on track by next year. Back to our event today. Last year, McGill launched a campaign called Made by McGill, the campaign for our third century. And this campaign is squarely aimed at tackling some of the key social, economic, environmental, and technological changes that we face as a society. And McGill wants to contribute to solving the problems that arise. That gets me back to our topic of today: Indigenous peoples' nutrition, food security, and well-being. As a Faculty of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences, we, with, among others, a School of Human Nutrition and a Department of Natural Resource Sciences, we are very well positioned to address the questions that relate to Indigenous dietary habits, procurement of food, and health. We all know that Indigenous communities face challenges which can range anywhere from seemingly straightforward questions to having access to safe drinking water, to much more complex questions of ensuring safe and healthy nutrition at distant locations, from providing education around health and nutrition, ranging all the way to reconciling physical needs and realities with cultural background and knowledge. There's never been a better time for our university and for our students, staff, academics, and alumni of our faculty to come together to take on the pressing challenges that are complex and, in this particular case, relatively unique to our Canadian context. I'm therefore very pleased that our faculty has the opportunity to present this topic to you. Let me introduce today's moderator and guest speakers. This masterclass will be moderated by Professor Murray Humphreys. He's the holder of the McGill Northern Research Chair, and he's the director of the Center for Indigenous Peoples' Nutrition and Environment, also called CINE, whose research focuses on environmental drivers of wildlife behavior, physiology, abundance, and distribution, with a particular focus on the impacts of environmental change on traditional food security in northern Canada. Our panelists include Trina Wazantillo Delormier, Associate Professor and Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Peoples' Nutrition and Food Security. She's the Associate Director of CINE. And Professor Niladri Bazoo, Canada Research Chair in Environmental Health Sciences. So with that, welcome to this very particular event. And I will turn over the word to Professor Murray Humphreys, who will moderate the discussion.
In 1996, at the World Food Summit, food security was defined to occur when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. In 2007, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples asserted that Indigenous peoples have an equal right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standards of physical and mental health. In 2010, the First Nations Information Governance Centre was formed in Canada around the protection of information about Indigenous peoples and the OCAP principles of ownership of group information, control over research, access to data, and possession of data. In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada called on governments to recognize and implement the healthcare rights of Aboriginal people as identified in international law, constitutional law, and under the treaties. In 2017, the final report of the Provost Task Force on Indigenous Studies and Indigenous Education stated McGill's obligation to learn more than is currently known and shared about its relationship with Indigenous peoples and communities, and the need to revisit and reestablish ethical and respectful requirements for university research carried out within Indigenous communities and territories. McGill's Centre for Indigenous Peoples Nutrition and Environment, or CINE for short, is an independent, multi-disciplinary research and education centre created in 1992 by Canada's Aboriginal leaders. CINE's mission is to collaborate with Indigenous and local communities in research and education related to food systems and ecological health. Today I have the opportunity to lead a panel discussion, including Trina Delormier and Niladru Basu, regarding Indigenous peoples' nutrition, food security, and well-being. I'd like to begin the discussion today by asking Trina and Nil to reflect on the following question. The FAO definition of food security, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the OCAP principles, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, and McGill's own task force on Indigenous studies and Indigenous education. I want to ask you, those collectively, are those definitions and commitments specified in those various documents and declarations? Are they distinct or related? In what ways do they all speak to a shared objective? And in what ways are they focused on quite different things? Trina, would you have a response to that question?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Murray. The way I see it is, all of these documents are have been used and are being used to advocate for Indigenous peoples' self-determination. So that's how I see them shared. So in the work that we're doing, often we'll use these documents to support self-determination, say in advocating for food system recognition or the way we do research, for example. And then, more in a national perspective for Canada, we have the Truth and Reconciliation, which is, addressing a very political issue that is implicating all Canadians. I see they have very different origins and distinct, on their own distinct purposes and contexts, which are all important from an international to a very local, like how we have the McGill, task force actions. But altogether, like I said, they're very powerful and useful documents to support self-determination for Indigenous people.
It's interesting. Just a quick follow-up, Trina. The self-determination in education, I guess, then is part of it in terms of the McGill commitment to those documents. Is it a similar thing? Self-determination in education, in food systems, in governance, they're all related?
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to Indigenous people having rights to make decisions about what they want, which hasn't been the case in, recent history, and then history going back, over 500 years. And in terms of self-determination education, we see right now, because of Truth and Reconciliation, the need for us to recreate and re-establish relationships between Canada, as a nation state and Indigenous people. At a local level, the universities are looking at ways that they ensure that Indigenous students are having access to universities to address inequities, but also the education that they are receiving in universities are addressing Indigenous knowledge systems, ways of knowing, include Indigenous knowledge holders as well as Indigenous faculty.
Thanks very much. No, when you reflect on those various documents and principles and declarations, how do you see them as different or similar?
I see them quite similar to how Trina described her feelings of them. I mean, at the core, if we look at the documents and the statements coming out of them, they basically all call for this explicit recognition that Indigenous peoples, Indigenous communities have core and basic rights, and that these rights need to be upheld and acknowledged. Also, in doing so, though, these organizations that range from local all the way to international make it very, very clear through these statements that the status quo is broken and that a new way is needed into the future. So these various organizations and their statements call for change, and the change is where there is some distinction. In a sense, you have organizations that sit at different levels. The UN and their Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples calls for actions that largely come from a top-down international perspective, whereas what we're doing here at McGill, trying to better engage with Indigenous communities in research and education, call for more local-based actions as well too. So in the end, philosophically, they're all headed in the right direction, which is necessary, but in terms of operationalizing what they're trying to do, they can be quite distinct.
Thanks. Just I think a follow-up reflection I would have on my own is just what Nil finished off on the importance of multiple jurisdictions, and that Indigenous peoples will often not be well represented by any one, by a federal declaration or an international one or a local one, but need all three commitments to realize that self-determination within McGill, within communities, within regions, to the nations, to internationally, and just the strength of those agreements that differ a little bit at each scale, but their complementarity to that notion of self-governance. If you look at all these documents in detail, from the UN Declaration to the Provost final report, with the obvious exception of the FAO food security definition, the words food and nutrition do not appear in any of them. Is that an oversight? Where does food fit into the commitment about the self-determination and the well-being of Indigenous peoples? I think I'll start with Nil for this one.
Sure. So I agree. I feel like it is an oversight. And, in my experiences with dozens of Indigenous communities around the world, any discussions with them almost always center on food, in the sense that it's food that brings communities together, that it's food that's a social fabric of communities. And when I think particularly of my work focused on the safety of food, the nutritional content of food, it really needs to be part of the discussion. So specifically, the work that we do focuses on whether or not food is safe or not. And when communities start to question the safety of their food, it really forces them as individuals and communities to shift away from these traditional lifestyles. So the notion of food being unsafe is a direct threat to Indigenous peoples, communities, their health and well-being. It's really a human rights issue, that communities have a right to safe, nutritious, plentiful food. So I feel that the absence of food in many of these declarations is indeed an oversight.
Thanks, Nil. Trina, anything to elaborate on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, food is so central to everybody's life, yet, I guess often it can be forgotten in these documents that tend to have, big, broad focuses on health or rights. The way, I think what is a very useful way to bring food into the conversation, given the fact that it's seen as missing from these important statements, is that identity is addressed in these documents often, how important Indigenous identity is and how it's constructed and how it's continued. And also health, and health is addressed because of the health inequities that Indigenous people experience. But identity and health are really quite linked. In a study that I had done in my own community, we talked about what does health mean, and how are we going to become a healthier community? And all of our discussions came back to identity, and it was the ability for Indigenous peoples to truly be who they are as Indigenous is at the core of being well. If you know who you are, you take care of yourself, you take care of your community, and your community takes care of you. But because of colonization and the policies that have disrupted relationships that build and that, are the way we keep our identity and practice our identity and know our identity have worked against that. So identity is so key to well-being. And then the other component to that is relationship to land, right? So a lot of these documents address Indigenous peoples' rights to their traditional territories and how the relationship with land is seen not as one of ownership, but one of stewardship. So not seeing that Indigenous people own land was interpreted as we can have that land. And so that disruption of Indigenous people being able to steward the land and the land taking care of them was disrupted. So restoring those relationships often happens through the way Indigenous people get food and how the food systems related to the land and the knowledge systems Indigenous people hold and use to continue that relationship, the ways that we understand that really support food and food systems. So by looking at identity, health, and land relationships, food is central to that as well. I mean, Neil explained that really well, but from this perspective of land relationships and identity and health, food is very central to that.
Thanks for you both. Just to emphasize a couple of points that I heard you both speak to, that as Nils talked about food safety and health and environmental health, and then both Nil and Trina talked about culture and identity and this connection to food, and then Trina extended into this land-based relationship. And I think what we want to try to communicate a bit is that although food is important for everyone, it's a universal human need and critical determinant of health. There's something particular about Indigenous food systems in their connection to identity and in their connection to land. I think a little bit about an agricultural example of the connection of agricultural people to land and to the land that produces the food that sustains them for nutrition and subsistence. And I think that's kind of a parallel in some ways with the Indigenous connection to lands, where the land nourishes people through food. But as Trina highlighted, this very notion of stewardship and relationship to land and wildlife and environment that really is central to Indigenous identity. My next question for Nil and Trina is to ask them to describe some specific initiatives that they're involved in that are helping to address knowledge priorities and improve outcomes related to Indigenous peoples' nutrition, food security, and well-being. And kind of in what way do these initiatives reflect the uniqueness of Indigenous peoples' food systems and incorporate OCAP principles related to the control and protection of information about Indigenous peoples? I'll start with Trina for this round.
Okay. So I'd like to talk about two initiatives that I'm currently involved with. One is related to my research program that's being supported by a Canada Research Chair looking at nutrition and food sovereignty. And, as we have been talking about definitions of food security, international definitions that we talked about, and even, thinking about Indigenous peoples' rights, when we're thinking about concepts of food security, and thinking about ways that we want to improve this with Indigenous communities, I think we have to really look at our concepts and definitions of food security and ways that we need to revise them or perhaps come up with new concepts that are going to address the unique food systems that Indigenous peoples have. This whole idea that it's food systems reflect relationships that Indigenous people have with the land. So I'm working on looking at concepts of food security, also food sovereignty, which I'll define a little bit more in a bit. But, thinking about how these concepts can be useful for research, because when we're doing research, we want to really understand what we're measuring and talking about. But how do we inform these concepts from Indigenous perspectives? Because it's within those perspectives that the nature of the concepts is relational. And the idea of food sovereignty again comes back to this notion of having rights and governance over what you're eating. And for Indigenous people, this comes back to having access to land, having access to knowledge systems, Indigenous knowledge systems that support the kind of food that not only supports health but identity, and it's the food that has been sustaining people from time immemorial, has been said. And so food sovereignty concepts from an Indigenous perspective requires that, we speak to people who understand knowledge in this way. And that requires, research, finding out these ways of knowing, but doing so in ways that are respectful. And when we think about how do we study a concept or something that, like a concept of food relationships with Indigenous people, the knowledge holders are the ones who can tell us some of the story. And so the other part of what I'm working on is it's actually with a larger group of people. We were funded to start a network that's focused on enhancing capacity of communities to do health research. And I know that sounds sort of like, okay, well, we have to go to communities and somehow, increase capacities so they can do research in the way that, Western institutions or, Western methods usually work. But actually that's not the case at all. It's again, it comes down to a relationship. So thinking about how can universities support the ways Indigenous people want to understand their health and their food systems. There's definitely a large number of researchers, or there's significant number of researchers at McGill who do work with Indigenous communities, and there's others who want to do work with Indigenous communities because this is what we're called to do through the actions that the Provost office has put forward. But we need to put infrastructure in place to support both researchers and communities to work together collaboratively. So this network is being set up to do that, to address what needs to change in the university and how can we better bridge the knowledge that's in the communities existing already and bring that together to do research projects that will be meaningful for Indigenous people, but then also, contributing to this broader mission we have as a university to contribute to keep contributing knowledge to, the broader societies. And I think Indigenous people have always been contributing knowledge, or their knowledge has been used to advance society, but hasn't maybe been recognized. So those things are changing. So I'll stop there for now, and then I'll let Neil also talk about what he's been working on, and then maybe I can comment a little bit further after.
Thanks, Trina. Over to you, Neil.
Sure, thanks, Trina. So in terms of my engagements with Indigenous peoples communities, for several years we've been collaborating with quite a number of partners on the ground throughout Canada and internationally. And when I reflect upon our engagements with these communities, as a researcher who continues to evolve and to grow, it became abundantly clear very early on that the model for doing research with Indigenous communities has to change. It essentially has to be flipped. And this goes back to what Trina was saying, where we put the communities first. So as a researcher, we have to learn to listen first and gain a deep empathy and deep empathetic understanding of the communities and what they need. So instead of going into communities with Western scientific approaches and know-hows, we need to first listen and to gain empathy and understanding of what's needed on the ground. So this community-based approach, that's also a participatory approach, is really what guides all of my research engagements with Indigenous communities. So in doing so, the latest studies we have involving the Kanesatake group of Mohawks near McGill here, the Aamjiwnaang First Nations in Ontario, for example, these are all projects that I've been involved with for a number of years now, in which I'm there to listen. And the work is principally led by communities and community membership and their leaderships. So they identify the problems. They come to my team and I for guidance. We provide some feedback. We help in the field as necessary. The work in the field is principally conducted by community members. We work with the community members to analyze the data, to sort of put it into context, to explain it back to the community. And in doing so, we get this really great co-equal partnership where all the stakeholders are treated equally and equitably. All the lines of communication are open. And in the end, I think we're able to sort of hit another level of understanding and really get to the root of many of the problems that are there. What's also occurred here is that the communities really own the work now, right? So it goes back to those OCAP principles where the ownership of the research and the research findings and the control over that is led by the communities. And again, if I just reflect upon my last 10, 15 years of working with communities, I feel like this has been a very good change in how many of us engage with Indigenous communities. And I think it's one that's going to result in more lasting, sustainable outcomes going into the future.
Thanks, Nil. I was going to add a couple of examples of things that I've been involved in, but there are very many parallels with what Trina and Nil have just spoke to. Nil talked about participatory research approaches, and I'll just use a related concept of knowledge co-production. So as a wildlife biologist, my training, my background is a focus on wildlife first and wildlife ecology and how wildlife interact or are affected by the environment. And as both Nil and Trina mentioned, we're learning to do things differently and better over time. And I think one of the things that I've learned to do is to put people first and put people and their relationship with wildlife first as the priority of the research. And the idea of knowledge co-production is the involvement of people at every stage of the research, co-identifying research priorities, identifying acceptable and rigorous methodologies, helping each other to interpret the data, to analyze and interpret, and then ultimately to apply the data. And so the kind of application of knowledge is not something left after the project as a knowledge translation or mobilization stage, but it's something central. What's the problem we're trying to solve? And I think as university-based researchers, kind of our role, Nil mentioned it, to listen, or Trina mentioned it, to how do we do research in support of communities' vision of food sovereignty. That's always a question of what's our role in these projects as scientists and researchers. And there's certainly been a lot of talk and concepts like from the Mi'kmaq elder, speaking of two-eyed seeing, ideas of knowledge braiding or knowledge bridging, the strength of both science and local knowledge when they're combined in an ethical space and a respectful, reciprocal circumstance. And some of the projects I'm most excited about, work we're doing in northern Quebec with the Cree of Eowishchi and the Inuit of Nunavik, are still a lot of wildlife research, whether it's collars on moose or it's mapping the distribution of beaver and where they're moving into in Nunavik in the climate change future. It's still core wildlife research, but it's done in collaboration with respect to knowledge, local knowledge priorities, and the inclusion of local knowledge. And what comes out of it is this really interesting mix of science and knowledge and research. And in the end, it's not really clear who discovered what, and it's very much not about discovery, but just about sharing and bridging and kind of formulating co-produced knowledge. The last example I wanted to bring was actually not one in research, but education, and this kind of flipping what we do. The way a typical undergraduate program is structured is that there's a lot of foundational building blocks at the base of a program. You get through first year and second year and third year, and finally maybe in fourth year you start to get some application, you get to get some synthesis, some integration. That model of education is fantastic for many undergraduates who can commit to a 3-year program, who can relocate, although not this semester, to a university. but how do we make that kind of knowledge, those kind of applications and integrations more accessible to Indigenous community members who are interested in access to university education, to interest in learning about science, but perhaps not as a 3-year degree program. So we've, with other people at CINE, developed what we call a professional development training program for Cree officers. It focused on fish and wildlife science, and we're really trying to teach fish and wildlife science at the same level as we do to our undergraduate and graduate students here. But we do it in a condensed curriculum. We travel as instructors to northern communities and deliver it there. The students also, the Cree officers also come to McGill to experience the learning environment here. And it's amazing when kind of flipping how you teach and how you approach knowledge, how much can be accomplished in relatively short teaching modules when they're customized towards the needs, the knowledge needs of Indigenous users. So those are the two examples that I wanted to bring forward. Does anybody have some kind of follow-up and cross bridges or opportunities in these initiatives that we're pursuing together?
I maybe, just a little bit of reality, like, not that this isn't a reality check, but it's not all, it's all very wonderful, it is, but there are some really significant challenges to doing this kind of work. And, in the work that we're doing, setting up this network to Network for Indigenous Health Research is around navigating ethical review in the university. Often the way these projects are proposed can face some challenges at ethics review because of the way the research is proposed and how, it's acceptable for the community, but not necessarily reviewed that way. I've heard that from communities. And so there's work to be done around looking at that aspect of research. How do we get ethics review for this kind of work? And then the other part is, like, after we have the research results, there's plenty of opportunities there, I think, that we can look at for how communities want to use that research. Right now, we're looking at some data or some results from the First Nations Food Environment Study that was done over 2 years ago. And, there's community members who are very interested in food security now and are saying, well, we have this data, how can we use it? And so that knowledge translation piece still doesn't get enough attention, but we do definitely have funding opportunities that support that. But then how we actually do that, once, the students especially have their thesis and whatever, like, how do we continue doing that piece after is, I see it as a huge opportunity to do a lot of work there.
Thanks, Trina. Nil, sort of on the same theme as reality check. This is difficult work to do. Can you speak to some of the challenges that happen at that interface of research and respectful relationships with Indigenous communities?
Yeah, it's to be frank, it's not for everyone. And even, all of us, I'm sure the way that we thought about this type of work 10, 15 years ago, our feelings have changed a lot. And we're continuously striving to learn and be, in fruitful partnerships with our communities. But there are, for many people who engage in this type of work, it's just not their cup of tea, which is fine. But I think it takes a special type of researcher with communities to actually fulfill promises that we make in the beginning. And these types of relationships are ones in which we just don't go in and out of. That once you commit to a community and to a project, you're committing essentially to a really long-term relationship. And to build these relationships takes time, it takes trust, and as such, we have to commit a lot of resources to it. So for me, it's a challenge, but it's actually an opportunity as well too. I feel some of my deepest relationships and partnerships and friendships are with communities and members of communities with whom I've been engaging with for a very, very long time.
Thanks very much. Just moving to the last question that I'd like to ask both of you, and I'll maybe go to Trina and then Nil with this one. Just, we've talked about the declarations and assertions and kind of commitments, that they're aspirational and difficult. We've talked about some of the difficulties of achieving those in practice. What do you see as kind of major areas of opportunity, of hope, of optimism, areas that need more support going forward that aren't getting the attention or the support that they need right now. Trina.
Yeah, so I'm very hopeful because, especially for food sovereignty work, in that youth are very interested. Youth in Indigenous communities are showing interest in not only health but in food systems and learning culture and knowledge. And we see how these are being supported also at the community level with language revitalization programs, with cultural ceremonies and practices being part of the way we're promoting health and addressing health issues in the community, including mental health, but also chronic diseases, as we see they're all related, right? So I think that's very hopeful. And it's not just happening at a community level. I think on a national level with Truth and Reconciliation, there's been a very, important first step, but it's also a very first step. And I think it's, a step that a lot of people still have to take toward recognizing how history is shaping the well-being of Indigenous communities today. And I think it's hopeful that we see a lot of efforts to, on behalf of universities and organizations on how can we do things better and differently, and be minded to trying to do better with that relationship. And I think just working with students, students also are, understand this really, the aspect of social justice and research work, and as it relates to food systems and sustainability and the health of our planet. I see how youth are not cynical at all, very hopeful and very creative and innovative. So that to me is very hopeful.
Thanks, Trina. Nil.
Yeah, I think there are elements of what Trina said that I completely agree with. So for me, I'm also hopeful, and I think I can touch upon three aspects which make me hopeful. One is education, one is activism, and one is empowerment. So in terms of education, as Trina mentioned, we as university professors, we're constantly being engaged by students who are very much committed to the cause and to ensuring that the food systems and the environment and nutrition are also safe and prosperous, and everyone has equal rights to these. And this plays out in many of the communities that we work with, especially the younger people in the community. So we need to find ways to harness the energy amongst our young students, especially those coming from Indigenous communities, and find them ways into the hallways of our university so that we can work more closely with them. So whether it's a program, Murray, that you described in which you brought CINE, into CINE a number of individuals from Northern Quebec, Trina, your engagements locally with local communities, I think these are very, very important. This can also cut across ages as well, too. So with the Truth and Reconciliation Committee and other programs that call for education right from the youngest to the oldest, I think there are ways that we can help individuals achieve educational goals at each level. In terms of activism, we see this playing out a lot in our streets these days, where you have communities, Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples crying afoul when they hear of violations of rights, environmental rights, food rights, you name it. And we've seen really over the last decade that this type of activism affects change. Many are very savvy with social media right now, which has been an effective way to spread information. And what this has done is that it's really helped spread evidence and information about cases concerning food insecurity and injustice. And, we've also seen in this area ways of activism that are playing out through arts and music and just very interesting ways of promoting change. We don't see activism just in our streets. We see it in the hallways of government. So I know myself, a lot of my work is focused on contaminants. And when I look at some of the key food contaminant issues and the realization of global policy instruments, many of these instruments came into place because we have eloquent Indigenous leaders and community organizations who can go to the hallways in Ottawa or in Geneva or in New York City and make passionate pleas that their environment, their food systems are not safe. And in doing so, we've seen multilateral environmental agreements come into play. we've seen change here in Canada. So I think activism extends from the streets all the way into the hallways of power and government. And then finally, empowerment. And I think we've all touched upon this a little bit, but we do see in a lot of our engagements, the work is being led by communities. And I think that's very, very powerful and important. And just seeing the way that funding systems have changed in Canada in the last few years, I think gives me a lot of hope. Whereas in the past, for all of us to do work with Indigenous communities, we as the academics in our universities would write the proposal, we would passively bring aboard Indigenous communities and members. That's changed now. And I know in all of our spheres, to get funding in this area, the proposal basically needs to be written by the community who passively sort of bring us aboard. And I think that's very powerful, because what it's done, at least in many of my projects, is really empowered the communities to define the research needs, to sketch out the program, to ensure that the funding is in place in their communities. And in doing so, we see this empowerment in the communities to really take charge of their own issues.
Thanks to you both. And I think I'll just add one very short comment right at the end. And I think one of the things I see as hope is the opportunity and the track record for universities to be agents of change. Yes, they can be traditional. Yes, they can, and those are important, those traditions, those legacies, those histories, but you can also see universities, and I think they can have done that, and they can do that more, as being a major leading agent of change in the relationship of research to Indigenous peoples and the relationship of education to Indigenous peoples. And I look very forward to seeing where McGill is as an institution over the next decade or two. We can do things differently.
Thank you, Professor Humphreys, for this very thoughtful discussion and the questions that led to these conversations. There's so many things that were said that made me think further, starting out with Professor Bazou's words that food insecurity and the lack of access to safe food is really a direct threat. It's a human rights issue, and I can't agree more, indeed. But then Professor Delormier also said that food is central to everybody's life, and it is in fact so central that it can be forgotten. It's just like the air that we breathe, and we take it for granted most of the time. But those who don't have access to safe food don't take it for granted. Now, the fact that apparently we, or many of us, do take it for granted may be an explanation for the fact that the mention of food is apparently missing from the UN Declaration and the Provost final report, but it certainly is not a justification, and that needs to be remedied, of course. Another observation that I found really interesting is that identity and health are linked. That at the core of being well is the necessity of having your identity and being able to practice that identity. I thought that was so insightful and gives me something to think about as well. Of course, as a dean of a faculty of agriculture, the other words that were really touching or important is the relationship to land, right? And particularly that the relationship to land in Indigenous communities or in Indigenous culture is not one of ownership, it is one of stewardship. And I think more and more, even conventional Western agriculture realizes the importance of the stewardship part, because the stewardship is what makes a difference for the entire world. We realize that in the context of climate change, of course. Anything that we do to our land, in particular, even at a very small location, will have an effect somewhere else. Anything that we put into our land might end up in some water that goes somewhere else and make that water unsafe to drink, for example. And the notion that the disruption of the relationship, that stewardship relationship for Indigenous communities has really compromised their ability to be the stewards of the land. Finally, something that is, of course, important for us as researchers and is something that Professor Bazou said, and that is the crucial importance to listen first. The colonial approach would be for Western researchers to go and proceed with whatever they learned at university as the research method. But it is so crucial, particularly in research that pertains to Indigenous culture and health and communities, is to proceed with a community-based approach where the community is not an afterthought, or the community is brought in at the front end of the research. The other term that Professor Humphreys mentioned was the knowledge co-production, right? That a researcher doesn't generate that knowledge on their own. They generate it together with other participants, which is called participatory research, of course. Finally, Professor Humphreys was able to link the entire nutrition and well-being piece to something that is very close to his heart, because that is what he studies, and that is the effect of climate change on wildlife, and therefore rather directly on nutrition as well, and health. Fundamentally, a lot of challenges, but this is where universities have an opportunity, actually, and therefore I really appreciated what Professor Bazou emphasized, that youth really keeps us on our toes, and we're constantly being engaged by youth, not only engaged, but challenged by youth, and something that really makes us optimistic in terms of our own outlook for the future is the activism and the empowerment that youth has and takes as their right in order to propel further what we do as researchers, and for youth to hopefully get engaged in research, in education. And there definitely is a need to develop opportunities for Indigenous youth to see universities as their opportunity to grow, as their opportunity to get an education and do exactly that, research or contribute in other ways back to the communities. And that is actually something that the Provost report spelled out very clearly, the necessity to make sure that Indigenous youth see themselves as a participant at a university, as a student, as a future researcher, not only in general at all universities, but of course at McGill in particular. I can speak for our institution. And the final word, of course, that Professor Humphreys said, the opportunity for universities to be an agent of change. Universities, and certainly ours with a 200-year history, can appear to be stuffy and to be rather inert. And a big university has, of course, its challenges when it comes to change. But we have also that incredible capital of about 40,000 students in the population of our university. And so change is something that will be brought about and we will be held accountable for at our university. So with that, I would like to thank, first of all, Professor Mary Humphreys for leading this really interesting discussion between our panelists. Thank you to the same panelists, Professor Trina Delormier and Professor Niladri Bazou. And special thanks to all of you who listened to us and joined into this session. I really hope to be able to see you again in the near future, either on one of the online channels that McGill developed, or in person preferably. Please stay safe and stay well.